Stargazing now on BBC One with Patrick Moore.
Empty Spanner out there. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Good evening. I'm sure you recognize those pictures. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepping out onto the surface of the moon from Apollo 11 in 1969. And yet, you know, about 30 years later, amazingly, there are still some people who genuinely believe that that never happened. The entire thing was faked by NASA. And we'll deal with that this evening. First of all, though, one news note. Our comet, Ikeya-Zhang. Quite a nice comet, and here are some pictures of it. Quite a nice tail, as you can see. And it's high up in the sky, tracking in the northern part of the sky. So make the most of it. It won't be back again for several centuries. And now on to our main theme. The space age began in 1957 with the launch of Russia's Sputnik 1. And the Russians took the lead. They sent Luna 1 past the moon, then Luna landed there and sent back pictures, and then along came the Americans. Apollo 8 took men around the moon, and then, of course, in July 1969, Apollo 11 actually landed there, and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped out onto the lunar surface. Now, I played a very minor part in the moon mapping. I was one of the moon map team. Therefore, I know those concerned, the astronauts, and also the many people who made that program possible. And one of those, Douglas Arnold, is with us today. Welcome back, Douglas.
Thank you, Patrick.
Can you tell us about your own involvement with NASA and the moon program?
Yes, I joined Kodak in the mid-1960s at the time of the Gemini project, and the company was much involved at that time with both manned and unmanned space missions. I developed a specialist knowledge about the problems and issues of space imaging techniques, and subsequently visited NASA locations, and particularly the Photographic Technology Division at Houston, on many occasions. After that, of course, I appeared for the very first time on Sky at Night in 1967 to discuss the lunar orbiter probes. And I was a member of the BBC TV Apollo studio team for the later Apollo missions with you and James Burke and Gene Schumacher and others. And for more years than I care to remember, I've also been space and astronomy correspondent of the British Journal of Photography.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's come on now to this weird idea that the lunar landings never happened and were faked by NASA. When any theory is put forward, it's easier to put forward arguments which sound very plausible until you look at them rather more carefully. And that's what we're going to do now. So what evidence is there? First of all, lunar rocks were brought back.
Yeah, about 850 pounds worth were brought back, 380 kilos by the astronauts, Patrick. Now, it has been argued that, well, these could have been brought back by unmanned spacecraft, but that would have been impossible with the technology of the time because, of course, the Soviets, you remember, did bring back some lunar rock. Indeed. But it was just a few grams or ounces. Now, subsequently, NASA sent rocks around the world to many scientists and geologists of many nationalities. Now, there has never been a suggestion that these rocks were anything than what they were. And of course there are enormous differences. They obviously evolved in a world which had no oxygen and water. They had isotopic properties which show that they've been bombarded by cosmic rays and by the solar wind. And also simply by looking at them with the eye, you can see that they've been bombarded by micrometeorites, which of course doesn't happen on Earth for the most part. So that there's no evidence whatsoever that these were fabricated. I have a scientific friend in the States who says that it could just about be possible to manufacture lunar rocks on Earth, but it will be so expensive and take so long that it was easier for Apollo to actually go to the moon.
Point taken. Now from now on, Douglas, I'm going to act as devil's advocate.
All right.
Now, I'm a conspiracy supporter. So first of all, That's right, would have been killed by radiation as soon as they went above the atmosphere.
Well, they would have been in extreme danger if there had been a major solar flare or coronal mass ejection, Patrick, when they were outside the Earth's atmosphere and so on. But that didn't fortunately occur. The evidence is subsequently that they received doses which were quite within the predicted bounds. 2 points I think can be made about this. There is a thing called the South Atlantic anomaly where the Van Allen radiation belts around the Earth come down quite low. Now, shuttle astronauts have been going through that since 1981 when the shuttle first threw without any apparent harm. Second point is, and people who have had their films X-rayed inadvertently when going abroad will realise this, film is very sensitive to radiation. Now, there is no doubt that the many, many pictures we've seen from near the moon, if not necessarily on the moon, around the moon, vehicle to vehicle, etc., these show no signs of radiation whatsoever. And of course also the shuttle astronauts, again since the early 1980s, have been bringing back tens of thousands of images. They would have been subjected to radiation in the South Atlantic anomaly if it was going to have any effect. No evidence whatsoever.
Let's come on now to some of the photographic sequences. We all saw Neil Armstrong come down the ladder and step out onto the moon. Well, who took that picture? Somebody on the moon, perhaps?
No, Little Green Man, no, Patrick. They had a TV camera on the outside of the lunar module, and when the crew was preparing for Neil Armstrong to come down, be the first one down the ladder, they initiated this, they switched on this camera, it deployed, and so that when Armstrong came down the ladder, he was being filmed, or rather a TV camera was recording him and of course transmitting the picture back to Earth.
We now have immensely detailed pictures of the moon, and yet none of these show any evidence of human activity there. No relics of Apollo.
Well, of course, from Earth this is very difficult, Patrick, anyhow, because of the turbulence of the Earth's atmosphere, and that's pretty well understood. Even with the later missions to the moon, like Clementine, although they were far higher resolution, it's still just about seeing signs of this sort of thing is just about beyond the bounds of their resolution. But we do have some evidence. It needs interpretation, but we do. Do you remember, way back in the 60s, one of the lunar orbiters photographed Surveyor 1 sitting on the lunar surface?
Yes, indeed.
Now, we couldn't actually see Surveyor. What we saw was a bright point of light throwing a very, very definite shadow. Now, nobody at that time said, oh, this is a fraud, Surveyor isn't on the lunar surface. They accepted the interpretation. Now, it so happens that we have a similar Apollo image. Apollo 15 was flying a big new camera, panoramic bar camera, which was high resolution. Now, they turned the camera on the landing site of Apollo 15, and we have a picture derived from that camera. Now, you need interpretation, and you can see it here, that you can see the track of the lunar rover, you can see the effects of the continual movement of the astronauts, you can see the shadow being thrown by the lunar module, and so on. Now, it's not terribly clear, I admit, but it is evidence that they were there if you accept the interpretation.
Another point. On the airless moon, the sky is black, but the pictures show no stars in that black sky.
No, well, they wouldn't, Patrick. It's a matter of photographic exposure. They were photographing themselves, the geological specimens, the scene around them, with typical daylight exposures for, by today's standards, a relatively slow film, 160 ISO, and they were using 125th at f11, 250th at f11, and so on. Now, that exposed well for the daylight, but of course completely underexposed the stars. Now, this can be demonstrated very, very easily by viewers. Go out into the garden, even with a simple one-shot camera, photograph the scene in the garden during the day. Nice picture, probably. Go out at night, nice starlit night if there is one, photograph the stars and see how many pictures, how many stars there are in the sky. There won't be very many.
Not a lot. Right, next point. On the airless moon, shadows are inky black. Therefore, you shouldn't see any detail inside the shadows, but you do.
Well, yes, let's look at a couple of the lunar pictures, actually. You are right, Patrick. The shadows are very, very intense because of the absence of atmosphere here. With the sun shining almost directly in the lens, you can see that the shadow is very black, very intense. Now, at other times, when the astronauts moved, the shadows teased out a little more. Here, we're not shooting directly into the sun, in this picture, for example. Now, it's a question of what reflectors are available, Patrick. Now, we can demonstrate this in the studio. Now, if you will agree to be the model, we'll light you with just one light.
I'm very good at casting shadows.
Now then, you see shadows, an extensive shadow on one side. I'm getting a reflector and I'm going to fill in on the side of your face. So it's not tremendously dramatic, but it just teases out the shadow somewhat and makes for a very nice picture. Now, they didn't have reflectors like that on the lunar surface, but, and I think we can demonstrate something very interesting here, Patrick, with this rather nice model. We have a lunar module and an astronaut in shadow with another astronaut who is in the sunlight. Now, let me elevate this astronaut who is in the sunlight and bring him in closely, still in the sun, towards the astronaut who is in shadow. Now, they were wearing very bright beta cloth spacesuits, and you can see what happens with these shadows. It's not an enormous difference, but because they're reflecting sunlight at the astronaut in shadow, you can see quite clearly the effects. Now, I should emphasize that, of course, my hand is also picking up some of this single light, so that that's also reflecting, so one wants to be fair about that. But there's no doubt at all that whether it was an astronaut like this, the lunar module, or other of the equipment that was on the surface, the lunar rover, for example, all of these things could, in the appropriate circumstances, have been teasing some light into the shadows. And, of course, there's the moon's surface itself. Although it is, of course, quite dark, relatively speaking, under certain circumstances it can be quite a strong reflector, which would have filled in the shadows.
There's another point too, isn't there? The sun from there is virtually a point source, and therefore shadows cast should be parallel, and they're not.
Well, they aren't, because they aren't on Earth very often, Patrick. Shadows will very often appear to be parallel if you have a completely flat surface, of course, but that's not often always the case. We can have, of course, quite undulating surfaces, and it was often very undulating on the lunar surface. Now, again, we can go to a model which we have in the studio. It's a rather elegant representation of the lunar surface. These aren't astronauts, they're little pieces of wood. But they make the point, you see. We have one light source in the studio, but do those shadows all look identical? Do they all look parallel? They don't to my eye. I don't know about yours. Now, you can see this in effect on the moon, Patrick. In this picture, we have the lunar module in the middle ground with two large rocks showing up very clearly in the foreground. Now, look at the shadows. They appear to be diverging. Now, this is partly a perspective effect, but it's also the result of the ground falling away very sharply in front of the rocks. So it's exactly the same thing as we saw on the model.
Well, some of the photographs brought back from the moon are superb. In fact, they are too good for being taken on the moon.
If you look at the whole body of the photography, like about 140 exposures per magazine load of the missions, you will see an enormous variety in quality. Because the subject is very often superb, you will have a relatively small number, which we've all seen, of pictures which are absolutely splendid. You will have some pictures which are absolutely awful. They're out of focus, they aren't even having the subject in them or whatever. The vast bulk of the photography is good, average sort of stuff taken for geological and other scientific purposes. And also, I think it's important to remember that the astronauts weren't professional photographers, and also they made mistakes. The Apollo 8 crew, for example, during that memorable mission,
indeed.
They exposed one film which was high speed, as though it were a very low speed, high resolution film, and vice versa. And they had to be rescued by the laboratory back in Houston. The Apollo 15 crew thought they knew all about how to load the movie camera during their mission. They didn't, and the film jammed. So it's a right mixture, and to say that it's all absolutely too superb to be true is nonsense.
Apollo 13 was scheduled to land near the crater Fra Mauro. It's been claimed, though, that at that stage Fra Mauro would have been in total darkness.
It's not true, frankly, Patrick. I've worked this out. You know, the explosion occurred on April the 13th, 1970, and at that time, the landing site at Fra Mauro was indeed in darkness, but it's totally irrelevant because they aren't landing at that moment. They were scheduled to land in the early hours of April the 16th, 1970, around 3 days later, and at that time, I've worked out the Fra Mauro area would have certainly been in daylight because I've got some pictures of the moon at exactly that same age as it would have been when Apollo 13 was due to go down to the surface. Here's a picture of it.
Yes,
and you'll see that Fra Mauro is well lit by the morning sun, so there would have been no problem whatsoever.
Agreed. Now, what about this rock with the letter C written on it?
John Young, the commander on this mission, photographed Charlie Duke, and we're seeing this picture now. He photographed him a few seconds before the picture which has got the C on the rock, and there is no C on that rock. Also, I've been back to Houston and looked at one of the master copy duplicates of the Apollo 16 film. Looked at that frame, and there is no C on that rock in that frame, which is the nearest we can get to the original. Now, I surmise, therefore, that when they were making these thousands of prints and transparencies for distribution to the media, that in one of the enlargers, one of the processing machines, a hair got into that area, and that's what you're seeing on this rock. There's no C written there by a wardrobe master saying, put Charlie's rock here.
Simple enough. What about other photographic effects?
Well, there's one which I always sort of put a little piece of shorthand to, smiles. There's a picture of, in one of the books, which argues in favour of it all being a fraud, which shows the Apollo 11 crew when they were in the lunar receiving vehicle back on the aircraft carrier after the mission. And the caption to this picture says, in effect, do the looks of these men, do they really look like those people who have come back to the Earth after a superbly successful achievement to be the first men on the moon? The supposition being that they're glum for some other reason. They're haunted by their consciences. In fact, they're listening to their head of state, the president, talking to them and greeting them. You wouldn't expect them to be jumping up and down, but there are other pictures taken on both sides of that one which show them as you would expect to be seeing them, elated and delighted. So it's a piece of, shall we politely say, very partial evidence.
I think that's true all the way through. And you know, when you examine these arguments carefully, there's nothing there. It's very easy to make interpretations that are simply not justified.
No, I agree, Patrick, and I think the very sad thing about these arguments is that when you and I and all of the people, the viewers, look at many of these superb images, they are really literally and metaphorically out of this world. They are recording an experience which most of us, of course, will never, unfortunately, ever experience. But they're marvellous, they're magical, and I think to say that all of this is a fraud demeans the achievement.
It certainly does, but I think no one will really now take it seriously. Douglas, thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Don't forget our website, www.bbc.co.uk/space or CFAX page 620. Also, it's newsletter time. If you want your newsletter, send your stamped, addressed envelope to The Sky at Night, BBC TV, London, W12 7TS. And when I come back next month, it'll be a rather special programme and rather longer than usual. It's going to be the 45th anniversary programme of The Sky at Night. So until then, good night.